Hi, everyone. My name is Trisha Mans, and I am currently a missionary with Global Ministries as a church and community worker. But when I was with the Young Adult Mission Service, I was a Global Mission Fellow, and I served in South Korea.
And my name's Bishop Laura Merrill, and I'm newly assigned to Arkansas since January, but as a young adult many moons ago, I served as what was then known as, in what was then known as the Mission Intern Program, also with the General Board of Global Ministries. And so it's really great to connect and cross paths with Trisha now in Arkansas, and we're just I'm looking forward to this chance to visit with you.
I am also. Thank you for agreeing to have a conversation with me about our time as Young Adult Missions. And I hope you all learn from this conversation and engage in missions in your own way.
Amen.
Amen.
I'd say the same thing. Well, I'll start.
Yeah.
So tell me, why did you apply for the Global Mission Fellows Program in the first place?
That is a very interesting question, right? It's very close to like, why were you called? So I remember that I was in education before I became a missionary, and I was working in the Chicago public school system, and I burned out in 2 years. In 2 years, I couldn't do the work anymore. And so I returned to my home in Atlanta and started just working in an after-school program as a part of a Methodist church. And that's when I felt re-engaged and like reconnected with God and was like, how can I continue to do this? How can I continue to do work and faith? Right? Where is that happening? Where I can just, and I don't want to be a pastor, right? I don't want to do, that's not where I thought I was being called. And so one day at church, 2 women just came and was talking about this missionary program and how you can do all kinds of work as a missionary. It's not that you have to just be in children's church, right? And so I decided to apply, and it was weird because I remember asking my mom about like, what did you think about this program, about the women that were talking? And she was like, what are you talking about? I don't remember anyone saying this.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, did we go to the same? We went to the same service. Like you were there.
This
and
was
so
a word for you.
It felt very much directed towards me that I was listening at that time and decided to apply because I was looking for a way to just have my faith with me in the way that I worked so that I could have that extra support because being burned out in 2 years is not fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need to recover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I will
That's
ask you, what did you learn about God, the church, or your call due to your service?
Oh, well, yeah, that I have to figure out the short answer to that question, right? My service, I started in 1987, and I was, I guess, 2.5 years out of college by that time, by that summer. My college career was in international studies, but at a United Methodist school, Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, and so there's a lot of integration of church as well as the impact of the church on the lives of suffering people across the world and efforts for peace at the time in the 80s. And what I learned, to jump to kind of the lesson of the time, that was the motivation, was the connectedness between that international aspect and a church aspect, and kind of the word and the word of life and the word of hope in the midst of suffering. But what I learned, I think, was just the way that is lived out in suffering communities. I mean, I learned about God, I learned about generosity, and I learned about hospitality.
Yes.
And in the most humble places is where often the freest sharing occurs. And that's not to romanticize poverty, but it is to say that the scriptural texts about Christ's love for the poor and God's love for the poor in the Old and the New Testament, there's a reason for that.
Yes.
And so to experience the joy of each other in those places, I found the truth of the gospel in that experience and in those communities, because my unlike your program, mine was both in Chile, in Latin America, but also then back in the United States. So it was a dual program for 3 years, and on both sides of that experience, that was the truth that I found. I'd heard about it, and then I got to experience it. I was very grateful. So what was a day in the life of your service like?
Quite boring, if I'm going to say. I worked in the office, and so I served in Korea with the National Council of Churches. I was working on their peace campaign, and so they had this ministry, I would say, that was ecumenical, so it was a lot of different denominations of Christian faith, and they were trying to reunite the Korean Peninsula, and because the Korean War is at a standstill, but it hasn't been, there hasn't been a peace treaty.
Right.
So I was working with that campaign on peace and just learning about peace work and what does that mean and how are we called to be peacekeepers, like it says in scripture. But really what my day looked like was sitting at a computer and like translating Korean articles and announcements to share to English speaking churches across the world, just about the importance of the work and what we were pushing for and what's the next step. And so I got to be in the room of a lot of great people, but my work was at a computer. Yeah.
Well, and this isn't a question on the card, but did you know Korean already? Or?
I did not. So my first 4 months in Korea, I went to Language Academy and was learning the language.
Wow.
And unfortunately, it has been some time.
Yes.
So
Yes,
I've
it
lost,
gets rusty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I lost a bit of it, but
Yeah.
I did, yeah. So it says the new tagline for GMF is see differently, serve differently, lead differently. How did the experience help you see through new lenses, and how do you serve or lead differently because of that?
I mean, I think, the most obvious piece of that for me is just not taking things for granted. I mean, I was raised in a household with great respect for working people and great respect for people who didn't have enough of what they needed. I mean, and we didn't have a lot in my home. My daddy was a Methodist preacher. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had everything we needed.
Yes.
And so this was in a place where people didn't have what they needed, and they were part of my life. And so I learned the ingenuity of people who don't have enough. I learned that poor people often have to work 3 times as hard to get what they need. I think it's this respect really for people who are in a difficult place, and again, not romanticizing, but just like you see things differently. I remember coming back from Chile, and it took me probably 2 weeks before I saw a car that I would count as old, based on the vehicles that folks drove where I lived. Curbs on the road, infrastructure, that an overpass or highway, those things we take for granted as they just kind of appear as part of living here. Well, they don't just appear; they cost money, and societies sometimes don't have the money to do that. So it's respect for resources, it's respect for people who are working hard, and then I think it's also then the flip side of that becomes you can do a lot with a little.
Yeah.
We can, that I say it a lot, and people are probably already tired. I've only been here a couple months, and people are probably tired of me saying it all the time. But we already have what we need to do our work. And if we don't think that's the case, it's because we're not seeing differently. We need to see differently what's already all around us, and so that's just as an eternal possibility, But it's seeing what we take for granted. That was the biggest part of being in a different place, was the part of our life that we just assume everybody does it that way. We assume everybody has that. Everybody likes that. And you get someplace else, it's just not true. And so it's disorienting. It was uncomfortable. But it was important, and it shaped, that's a long time ago, but it shaped how I continue to see today.
That's great. I also think because of how the world had to shift their perspective because of the pandemic.
Sure.
Right? And so having that, we are already practicing.
That's right.
Doing that.
But it's those shattering events, it's hard to, it happens anytime somebody has a dramatic shift in their life that, well, I didn't realize that, and
Yeah.
now I know something I didn't know before. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm next. Am I next? Yes.
Yes.
How has your experience in the GMF influenced your call since the time of your service?
Oh, okay. So after
Yeah.
so after I finished my time as a missionary in Korea, I was adamant that I was done, right? That in all of the goodness and the transformative ways that I was experiencing, there was also I was lonely away from my family. There were so many things, and so I was adamant that I was done with being called, right? Had God called me, I answered, I served, I'm done, right? And so and so I came back home and I became an administrative assistant, and I was back to feeling exhausted. That same feeling from before,
Oh my
right?
gosh.
Came back immediately, and I was only there for maybe 7 months, and I was like, well, God, where am I supposed to go?
What am I
Where
supposed to
am
do
I
if it's
supposed
not
to go?
this? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I hope this is answering the question.
Sure.
But yeah, I have decided that it is important for my overall wellness to continue to be in places where I can walk in my faith and walk in my passion and not have to separate those two.
Yeah.
It's really important. And I think being a missionary is exactly that. You get to be walk in your faith and be a doctor. You get to walk in your faith and be a teacher. You get to walk in your faith and be a farmer. And so this is where I know I belong now. Yeah.
That's great.
How did culture shock impact you? Do you have a funny story or a
Oh, good
misunderstanding?
Lord. I mean, the funny stories, they mostly involved language, and I studied a lot of Spanish before I left for South America, and that's why they sent me where they sent me, right? Because I had all this language training, and it was true. Like I mean, I wasn't fluent because I'd never had to speak it other than one summer in Mexico, but I got there, and first of all, the accent's different, the vocabulary is very different, and I just found myself, struggling. First of all, I didn't know how to talk about complex things initially, and so you're in a new place, and everything's different, and I have questions, and that reminds me of this, and so I felt like not a human being for easily 3 to 4 months. People were so kind to me, and they invited me to their home and all that, but I couldn't share what I was thinking, and so that was very hard. Practically, I'll never forget, a lot of times, a lot of my work, I worked with an ecumenical agency, and we would go out and visit different types of projects. And one of my friends and I would ride on the bus, and the bus was always loud, and she'd be sitting here, and I'd be sitting here, and those buses have those little things right here?
Yes.
So I'm trying to sit up and watch her mouth move so I can hear, and I can't hardly hear her. And I'm trying to understand what she's saying. And by about 3 o'clock every day, I was ready to get in bed. I was done. I was exhausted.
Yes.
It was exhausting.
Yes.
Culture shock is exhausting physically. And so the funny things would be the times that, I mean, they're not that funny now. They sound funny when you do it, but there's a word for a football field, for a soccer field. This sounds a lot like the word for pig, and I would always use the wrong word. I'd call the soccer field a pig.
A pig.
And then, one time I called on, I was trying to make a collect call home, and you would call reverse the charges, and I said scramble the charges like eggs, so just dumb stuff. And the thing about it, of course, is that they loved me, and they would just laugh and point and just laugh, and then we'd hear about for the next week what did the gringa say, so that was mostly it. It was just a lot of fatigue, a lot of depression at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think I was saying earlier, it's like I was in a port town, and there were these big tankers that would come in, and I was like, man, I might just jump one of those and go back home. I mean, maybe, you know. But it probably took a good 4 months before I felt like I could make my way around, make myself understood most of the time, even if I sounded like an idiot half the time. But, at least I wasn't afraid to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Because there was no one who spoke English in my life at all. And so it was like, man, you better sink or swim.
Yeah.
You got to figure it out.
And you became bishop, so it worked.
Well, I will say the Spanish finally stuck in my head. And even when I came home in the December of '88, and I didn't go back to Chile until the summer of 2015.
Oh.
And even coming back then from 3 weeks in 2015, I was dreaming in Spanish again.
Wow.
I mean, it's in there. It's not always perfect, but it's in there.
It's in there.
It's in there pretty solid. So
I want to also say thank you for saying culture shock is exhausting.
Oh.
It is. And
It
people don't often tell
No.
you that or share that.
And I hope we can remember that when we think about people here
Yes.
who aren't from here. Man, or any culture,
Yes,
any movement, even here in
any
Arkansas, after a long day, I'm like, wow, that was a lot. Just to try to learn what you don't know. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
it makes you want to take a nap. So do you have a sacred moment or a favorite story from your time that you would want to share?
Yes. So I have reconnected with outside. I want to be honest and say I did not do a lot of things outside before I moved to Korea. But Korea has, or South Korea specifically, has so many mountains and people just hike everywhere. And it's gorgeous. There's rivers and water and mountains everywhere. And so in my attempt to adjust to the culture, right, I participated in hiking. And so that became a thing, or just like walking along the river. There's a river that cuts through Seoul. And so I have enjoyed being outside ever since. I came home. I did hikes in North Georgia. I'll do hikes here in Arkansas, right? I do really enjoy being outside now more than I did before. And it is where I meet God most often, is when I'm walking up a mountain. I am exhausted and tired, and it is work, but it is still quite peaceful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And worth doing.
Yeah. I'm curious about whether you have a spiritual practice also.
I mean, I'm very glad to be here in this just incredibly beautiful state. And it's so funny the number of times people have asked, "Are you a hiker?" And I'm kind of like, well, how many times do you have to hike in a year to get called a hiker? But I have loved the, exploration that I've been able to do so far. I don't like backpack and sleep in the mountains and all that stuff, but I have climbed a couple of steep places here already, and look forward to doing more of that. I'm very grateful to live near the Arkansas River,
Yes.
and even just on an evening after a long day to walk out and kind of see the sunset over the river is it will quickly become a spiritual practice for me. Yeah,
That's great.
It's a place of peace and kind of grounding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My last question for you.
Yeah.
What would you advise your past 20-something self or current young adults that are applying to the program?
Boy, that's a good question, and I'm not sure if I would answer the same to both, right? Because maybe other people aren't as neurotic as I was when I was in my 20s. But I think I would probably say, try not to sweat the small stuff. I think that in general, looking back, and even at the time, I feel like I was trying to grab the day for myself and to experience all that I could. I had incredible wanderlust, which is how I ended up signing up for the program in the first place.
Yes.
I was very, very interested in seeing the world, and it was hard and it was scary and all that, but I'm glad to have done it, and so I would just affirm that in myself, and I would affirm that in other young people who are thinking about this, that curiosity about the world is a good thing, and I think it's something God puts in us. And if it's not this program, then some other way.
Yeah.
You know, put yourself in a community where everybody's not like you, and it is uncomfortable, right? And it causes you to have to extend yourself or exert yourself in a new way, but that's worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just to say that whatever's hard and whatever's you know, challenging or sad or depressing or scary or whatever, that that it's worth it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, what advice do you have for the Global Mission Fellows Program?
For the program?
Yeah.
I think I am really impressed by how the program has transformed and lasted for as long as it has,
Right.
and continues to be a space for young adults to experience new cultures, learn new languages, learn more faith practices, and become deeper in faith. It's not something I have seen in any other space, right?
Yeah.
And when you're that young and you're surrounded by other people who are also young, it's
amazing.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And so I am proud that I got to participate in it, and I'm excited for whatever new things come from this program with these new generations coming through.
Right.